Your loved ones are getting older. You need to sort a solution for them. What next?
You're listening to another Torched original. Are you feeling stuck when it comes to creating content for you and your business? Would you like a podcast of your very own? Or maybe you'd like to stand out and reach new audiences? Head to gettorched.com. That's GETTORCHT.com today, and we look forward to helping you on your content creation journey. And now, enjoy the show.
Today's guest on this show is Rodney Horin. I think I've got that right. And we're talking about aged care, which when I started this journey of podcasting, had someone said to me, you're going to have someone on your podcast talking about aged care, I would have laughed. But when we were connected by a gorgeous lady that trains with me, we got talking about potential guests and your name popped up, and it really hit me because my dad and his partner, who has Alzheimer's, which is really quite sad, they're sort of at that stage, and my husband's parents are in their 80s. So we're looking at that. And I have an uncle also that's in his late 70s, and I'm sort of the one that he's got closest to him here in Melbourne. And I felt this pressure on what next, basically, and I have no idea. So when this popped up, I couldn't have thought of a better topic to have on the show than talking about the difference between aged care, independent living, centrelink, RADs. There's all this terminology that I've already looked at but had no idea what it meant. And it ties into that wellness side of things because it's a stressor for the kids or whoever's the carer. So if we can simplify the forest or whatever you say, then it's a good topic. So, Rodney, I'm going to throw to you. Please tell us who the hell Rodney is.
Thank you. Thank you very much for having me. And if we can, as a result of this podcast, can clarify and create some meaningful information to listeners, that'll be a tremendous service. Look, I might begin by telling you my story and how I got to be in this position where we can have this conversation. So it's about 7 or 8 years ago, and as I often say to adult children usually who come in to talk about how to assist their parents, don't be too hard on yourself because one never knows in life whether it's going to be their lot. You might have both parents leave this earth not via the aged care pathway. For example, I lost my father through palliative care, so aged care was never an issue. But and as he was passing, he asked me to promised him to look after my mother as long as we could. And of course, my 2 sisters who live in Sydney was left on myself and my wife and children, and it was a pleasure. And we tried our utmost because she was from a typical generation. The only way I want to leave my home is in a pine box. Don't ever throw me into an old person's home. My
dad's the same. If I have to wipe my bum, if someone else has to wipe my bum, I'm out.
Correct, exactly. And it's so common no matter what background, culture, religion, community. So we tried our best, and it basically went 1 carer, 2 carer, 3 carers around the clock. It ultimately was a disaster, incredibly expensive, and it was like managing another workforce again, managing people, the roster system, and particularly in the night shift. Anyone who was on the night shift didn't want anything untoward to happen under their watch. They didn't want to be responsible for it. So if my mother at 1, 2, 3 in the morning turned the wrong way, made a noise, first thing this carer would do was pick up the phone and call me. I'd run over in the middle of the night in a pair of boxers and a T-shirt, and before I knew it, I was in the back of an ambulance at Alfred Hospital. That was my lot for about 6-9 months.
Wow.
Unsustainable, young children trying to run a small business. It was a pretty hectic period, stressful and anxious. Anyhow, my mother wasn't going to listen to me. I'm only her son. But on one of the last of those many trips to Alfred, the authorities put their foot down and said, Mrs. Horin, you can't go back to live on your own. So she listened to them because they were someone of authority. So I said, well, what do I do now? And they said, I don't care what you do now. We need her bed back in 3 days. Go and find her an aged care bed. So I took the next day off work. It was the most daunting day I've ever experienced. And I visited 7 places. The first place I went into, I'd known about because we had some clients from our core business residing there. And I thought, yeah, this is a nice place, beautiful grounds, it looks well run, it's modern. I think I could sell the concept of this to my mother. And there was everyone walking around, similar profiles, walkers, wheelchairs, walking sticks. Yep, this is mum would fit in here. So I go up to inquire about aged care, and they said to me, you're at the wrong place, we're not in aged care. So I said, excuse me, everyone around here looks like the same sort of profile as my mother. If this is not aged care, what do you call it? They said, this is retirement living, buddy, you're at the wrong place. So if you would have asked me 7 or 8 years ago now, if I knew the difference between retirement living and aged care, the answer was absolutely not.
Well, that was me. Before we were introduced, I thought I better research this topic.
Correct.
Had no idea.
I went to 6 other places that day. Unbeknown, I found out a day or two later when I had found some help, only 4 of the 7 places I saw that day were aged care facilities. So I could have conceivably made a huge mistake that would have been costly financially, but worse than that, it would have been the wrong level of care facility to put in. So, just walking around absolutely not knowing what you're looking at. Not only that, everyone throws this unbelievably intimidated 40-page Centrelink document in your hand and said, don't talk to us till you've completed it.
When you think Centrelink
40 pages, 140
confusing.
questions.
Yep.
So I'm a lawyer by profession. I'm not overly intimidated by documentation, but that day wore me out.
Well, it's emotional as well, right?
Enormously emotional.
Yeah.
So I came into work the next day and I asked my young partner, who's much more technically savvy than I am, I need help. Can you do me a favour? Can you Google looking for an aged care advisor to help me? I knew I needed someone to hold my hand and guide me through it. We searched and searched, nothing came up. A few financial planners came up, proffering to have some expertise in the area, but when you rang them, you realised they were just trying to sell your product, a life cover, a death cover. They weren't quite right. I wanted to find someone like going to an accountant or lawyer, charge me an hourly rate, hold my hand and guide me through it. Couldn't find anyone. Eventually asked around with friends in the community. Someone gave me a card of a 72-year-old gentleman, came into our office and saved our family $250,000.
What?
$250,000. It was
Wow.
a light bulb. So if I'd attempted to bungle through this, I'm sending up spreadsheets to my sisters in Sydney saying, I think we're up for a thing called a RAD, but maybe it's a DAP or a DAC or a means tested fee or an extra service fee. I didn't know what I was saying. This is what it's going to cost. This gentleman had some expertise, and who knew that getting into an aged care facility was tantamount to negotiating for a used car. If there was more beds available than there was demand, they were highly negotiable. So they dropped to $150,000. The Centrelink fee that I thought I had just had to pay was a cost, $25,000 a year. Turns out my mother didn't need to. She was low means, and we got back an assessment of nil. So if I'd attempted to go through this on my own, I wouldn't have known you can negotiate. I would have paid $25,000 a year to the Centrelink, and I wouldn't have known anything different. It was such an experience. I offered this gentleman a job on the spot. He's 72 years of age. He started the next day and worked for the next 4 years till he was 76. And I went out to our open plan area to my 2 partners, and I said I'd like to go into the aged care advisory business today for 2 reasons. I wanted to share my story with others, and I just wanted to see whether I was the only idiot around who didn't understand it. So the very next day, we sent out an attachment to our normal daily newsletter on financial services, referring to a new financial advisory service in the aged care space. We've been busy ever since.
I was going to say.
4 or 5 people. And we've had highest credentialed people in the state come into on the country. Chief Justice, the Supreme Court. We've had judges of all sort of different levels. We've had top accountants and medicos. It doesn't matter who you are. When you get confronted without any sort of preparation into a world where they change a simple word like a bond, and they now call a bond a RAD, and a RAD can be payable either via a DAP, DAC or a RAC. What hope have you got of understanding it?
I've got them there, DAP, DAC and RAC.
Yeah. So, who understands
Just doesn't have
that?
SAC, I don't think.
Yeah,
I'm not sure.
that's right. It's unbelievable. Then there's extra services fees, whatever that means, and then there's a centrelink fee, and it is ridiculous. It's a sort of a
minefield.
a minefield
Yeah.
of confusion and complexity. So to really sort of clarify what we do, and by exclusion, we're not involved in choosing the facility because that's a very personal decision. The family has to choose the facility that suits them best. And for everyone who likes one, someone else who doesn't. So that's
Yeah.
a personal
So you have a
decision.
list?
We can recommend. We say where would you like the person to be? Usually in a location nearby
Yeah.
where family is, and we'll say there's 4 or 5 you should check out.
Great.
And we're not involved in home care. We're not involved in independent living or retirement living, but I'll explain the differences.
Yes, please.
We have a really narrow offering. Once the family chooses where they'd like their loved one to go, we have an Australian Financial Services licence which allows us to give financial advice, and then we'll model their financial circumstances and come back to them with 3 or 4 different optional scenarios, and which shows clearly what drops out of each one of them. In other words, there's probably about 10 most commonly asked questions. We'll model, if we retain the home and rent it out and we fund the RAD this way or that way, what does that look like? If we sell the home, what does that look like? There are a myriad of different ways to either fund it, which is the outlay for the right to the room, and then also having the cash flow to pay for the monthly expenses. I might just say at this point to help sort of get this explanation through to your listeners, aged care is basically divided into 2 parts. Mm-hmm. The first part is what do you pay for the right to use the room? Commonly known as a bond.
Right.
That bond can be paid, now known as a RAD, can only be paid one of 3 ways. You can pay the full
Lump
amount
sum.
up front,
Yep.
and that's fully refundable at the end of the day. You could do a cocktail, which is, say it's a $600,000 RAD. You could put $100,000 down, and you could pay interest on the $500,000. Or you can pay, the third and only other option is you can pay interest on the whole lot. But the interest rate is very high. It's set under the Aged Care Act. It's 6.31% at the moment.
Wow.
So on $1 million bond, and there are many facilities that ask that, that's $63,100 a year. It's a lot of money. But they're the 3 options for funding the bond. Then you can draw a line under that. The second part of aged care is every month, I often say to parents who've come through, if you've got children you've sent to private schools, the monthly invoices you're now going to see for aged care for your parents are far higher than what you used to pay for a semester at a private school. So they're mind-boggling.
Yes.
And if you've got 2 parents, you can double it.
Wow.
So for one person, you'll get an invoice every month that could be made up of 4 line items. The first one is set under the Aged Care Act. You're charged out at $56.87 a day. It's called the daily care fee. That's reasonable. It's about $1,500 a month. Then depending on the facility, you could be charged another $50 a day for what they call extra services, which most people don't get any value for, but you need to pay it. It could be another $1,500 or $1,200 a month. And then you could have 2 other fees. One is the interest rate if you're not putting the lump sum down. And then the doozy, the last one, is what they call a centrelink, means-tested fee. And basically, that is, if one can afford it, the government assesses, they're asking you to contribute towards the cost of the care.
So this is on top of everything else.
Yeah.
Because I was reading that thinking, because it said no one needs to miss out on aged care if you can't. Was that a different?
No, but you're quite right. Thank you for raising that point. In all fairness, aged care, this country is tremendous because no elderly person can be denied an aged care bed. If you've got nothing to your name, if you only earn a full pension, you can get into the best facility in Australia. It could be $1 million or more bond. You won't pay a cent. All you'll pay is the $56.87 a day, which is not a figure just sort of plucked out of nowhere. It's 85% of the full daily pension you receive. So if you're on a full pension of about $900 and something a fortnight, 85% of that will fund you. That's all you'll pay to have a bed in a facility. So it's a reality really in most areas of life. If you've got nothing, the government makes sure you can get an aged care bed. You're not denied it. If you're wealthy, certainly you can afford it. But it is that very large middle band always that struggles to fund it.
Yes.
And if you've got two parents needing to go in, and many still do, you could pay, say, $1 million, twice as $2 million for two parents. And if the fees...
Don't do a 2-for-1 deal.
No, yeah, it's a good point. We sometimes negotiate that. And then if it's about $8,000 a month, it could be $16,000 for two. So it's
This is
mind-boggling.
crazy money.
This is crazy money. But I'll share a few things with you. It is tied to the area where one lives. In other words, if there's a facility, take Arcare, a well-known operator, they sort of basically have the same footprint for all their facilities now. They'll have the same one in Kooyong Road, Caulfield, as they will have out in Cranbourne. But the difference is the land costs less in Cranbourne. But if what they'll charge in Caulfield, because the land costs more, if a person is selling their family home in Caulfield, it'll usually allow them to fund an aged care bed in the same suburb. So, but if someone's in Cranbourne, they're not going to be able to sell their home and fund to get into Caulfield, but they'll be able to fund a bed in Cranbourne. So it is related to the land price differences.
Right.
But
you have to sell the family home.
you don't always. So, certainly people come in with usually a lot of common questions. Do I have to sell? There's a lot of misnomers about myths around. Do I have to sell the family home? Do I have to hand over my pension to the facility, etc.? And the answer is no to most of those questions.
Okay.
Now, there are ways to do it. In fact, if you can hang on to the family home for 2 years, it helps. There's so many nuances and things that you need to sort of find a middle ground for and a sweet spot. If you asked an elderly person what is their sort of most precious asset, it's usually their pension. No one ever wants to lose their pension. So if you've got a pension and you don't have to sell the home for 2 years, the home is only capped and valued at $187,000 maximum, and you'll keep your pension. But after 2 years, the government will say, hey, your principal place of residence now has moved from the home to the aged care. And therefore that home, if you've been able to keep it, is now going to be considered an investment property, and you'll probably lose your pension as a result.
But you keep the home.
But you'll keep the home. So there are different trade-offs and nuances, and what we do is we provide really clarifying information, maybe 3 or 4 different options, different scenarios, how you can both fund it and provide for your cash flow for your monthly fees. And we go out 5 years, so clients have a roadmap. They can see how they're going to do it over the next 5 years. And most of the clients who come and see us were as anxious and overwhelmed as I was, and they seem to find a sense of relief once we've spent 20 minutes, half an hour talking. I say to them, look, you concentrate on the well-being and the care, find the right facility, look after mum and dad, and I'll guide you through the financial, pathway.
Because there's a big there is a pathway, like even like you said, the centrelink. Yeah. So is that something that you do?
Yes, we handle all the centrelink paperwork. Yep. If we find in some situations we model that they may be eligible for a pension they've never had before, that can be the case, then we'll help them with a pension application. Dealing with centrelink is daunting.
Yes, but you also mentioned before you get your parents an assessment.
Yes, the first prerequisite, thanks for raising that again as well, you can't enter the system. No aged care facility can enter you in the system and get their government subsidy. I'll come back to that government subsidy in a sec. Without having what they call an ACAT, an Australian Commonwealth Age Assessment. And that's usually organised through facility or through the GP. They come out and assess a person whether they're deemed eligible for either respite or permanent care or both. So you need that assessment to go into care. I mean, it's some good
everyone
reason.
has that.
Everyone has that. So when someone calls us initially, we just say, are you aware that you need an ACAT assessment? And most of the time they sort of are.
Yes.
They've obtained that, they've sought that, it's gone through my Gov, etc., and they've got to that point. And then because that's an assessment that tells the facility the sort of medical requirements of what their care needs are.
Yep.
And then I want to come back to the point you raised, the $56 a day. So at the very basic, the very minimum, you pay $56 a day. And when you think about it, how can a facility look after you for $56 a day? It's not enough. They can't give you 3 meals and the care and a brand new facility to run and power and heating and staff. The government subsidises up to another $250 plus. And so you need that ACAT assessment for them to get you in the system. They charge you the 56 and then they get from the government the balance.
The rest, yep.
If you don't have that assessment, you'll pay what they call an unfunded rate, which is about $300 a day, which is what the facility needs. So everyone who goes in needs to get that assessment.
Have the assessment. Otherwise, you're paying.
Yeah.
And is the assessment charged or is that?
No, it's free actually.
It's free, okay.
And I'm not a proponent or an advocate for saying go into aged care immediately, but I can say financially far, far more expensive keeping someone at home with full-time care. It can be up to $8,000-$10,000 a week to have full-time care at home 24/7.
Right.
It's exorbitantly expensive just based on manual labour, etc. So I actually have some empathy for the aged care industry. It's a bit like, you imagine, it's a bit like schools. The kids can be great, but the schools and the headmaster and the teachers have got to deal with the parents.
Yes.
In the aged care, the resident may be terrific, but the facility's got to deal with the siblings, the 2, 3, 4 kids. Sometimes there's a fair bit of guilt and you're not making the right chicken soup my mother's used to, or the souvlaki or the spaghetti. So they've got to deal with the parents.
It's emotion, isn't it?
A lot of emotions and a lot of guilt too. Yep. Getting a family in one room talking about what they want for their parents is also tricky.
Yes.
There's usually someone who might have an ulterior motive. I don't want to spend that much on mum and dad. There's all sorts of navigation you've got to sort of get through.
Yeah, it gets murky, I don't know.
But I'll share some lovely experiences. So 98% of the time, adult children come in, usually time poor, they've got a busy life, they've got kids, they're really juggling, sandwich generation, it's hard on everyone. But 2 or 3% of the time, an elderly person will shuffle in on their own with their faculties. And so I want to go in while I can be the master of my own fate, before the decision's taken out of my hands, help me get in there, and I don't want to be a burden to my children. They're beautiful stories.
Yeah.
They are gorgeous stories.
Yes.
And they actually, if they go in a bit early, they actually enjoy some of the offerings.
Yeah.
So they're terrific stories.
You get the other side of the coin where it's like, I'm not going into care.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
I know.
That would be tricky.
Yeah, that's very tricky.
Yeah.
And so there's a bit of a halfway mark. People often get stuck at that point, or families and the resistance, and understandably. So there is a fabulous word, it's a fabulous concept called respite. Respite basically means try before you buy.
They go in for a
couple of weeks, and I must say, so that, and then they're told, we're not throwing the key away, we've just bought you a holiday for a couple of weeks, just to have a break, good for you, good for everyone, let's just see, it'll just break the cycle. And I must tell you, I observed over the years that there's a really high strike rate of respite leading to permanent care, because people may be resistant, but once they get in, it's usually a brighter, cleaner, more modern facility than where they've been living for years.
I was going to say, so the respite facility is a separate facility.
No, it's in the aged care.
It's in the aged care.
The aged care facilities these days are nowhere near what they used to be. They're modern facilities, and they've got good amenities, and you're not going to what we imagined years ago.
So the bond or the RAD, is that changes the whatever it is based on where the aged care facility is, or
yes, and rooms in the facility.
Right, so if they're sort of fairly full, they can demand more.
Correct, they're not. You can negotiate.
Right.
We had a situation where they wanted $950,000 and they accepted only late last week $600,000.
Right.
It's a big difference.
Yep.
And some of the other fees could be negotiated. The extra service fee could come down. And there's a whole lot of nuances. If cash flow's a problem to paying the monthly bills, you can have them deducted from the bond they're holding. So there are strategies.
So the bond, the RAD, does that get refunded?
Fully, 100%.
Once.
Never used to, but it does now.
Yep.
Whatever you pay, you don't earn interest on it.
No.
But
they do, I'm sure.
They do. They can use it, absolutely. And it's fully refundable.
Okay.
So not only that, it takes assessable assets, whatever you pay for the bond, and turns them into non-assessable, which can help you with your pension. So this is invariably what happens.
We need a blackboard.
And I'll give you this, hopefully, as a clear example. There could be a little old man or a little old lady living somewhere. They've got only a few $1,000s in the bank. They're on a full pension. But with the crazy property prices we've seen over the last 15 years, this little flat that they own is all of a sudden worth $1.5 million. So they sell that flat. They pay over $500,000 or $600,000 to the bond, but the balance left over, they'll lose their pension. And so we need to juggle that and see what we can do. And there are strategies for doing that.
Yes.
And also for trying to have that government means-tested fee reduced. So there's, as I said earlier, there's sort of some sweet spots we model to try and get it right.
Yes.
So our aim is to get you into the facility you want to be in, to stretch the money as far as we can by different methods and with the best financial outcome.
Right. Yep.
My experience convinced me there must be tens of thousands of people every year unnecessarily overpaying
There'd have to
care,
be.
and not only overpaying to get into care, continuing to overpay on a monthly basis. So, for example, we got this $150,000 reduction for the bond, and then we saved that $25,000 a year on the fees when I didn't realise my mother would have a nil assessment because she was deemed low means.
Yep.
So, I see it all the time. Not only that, we've had many other examples where someone can come in, they are low means, they don't realise that having
So this is
nothing,
the CAS assessment have deemed them, they don't really...
This is financially, when we look and they've only got a pension, they've just renting,
Gotcha.
they haven't got any means, any
Yep.
financial,
Yep.
and they're wondering how they can find the money to pay a bond. It's been amazing when we tell them and saying, by the way, I don't think you'll have to. We think because of your situation, we'll be able to get you a
Gotcha.
bed for no fee. Can you
Yep.
imagine?
Yeah.
The pressure off the family.
Be
They're wondering
huge.
how they're going to find hundreds of thousands of dollars.
And then all of a sudden
and
they
they
don't.
don't need it. So there must be people who've scraped together somehow, big borrowing with family members unnecessarily.
Yes.
I really believe that. It must
Yep.
be tens of thousands of people every year overpaying unnecessarily when they don't have to.
Yes. Yeah, I would imagine.
So it's I must say this, I've had a few change of careers in my time, but I've never worked in an area where client satisfaction is as high. We're continually getting thank you for guiding us through
Well,
this
I can
maze.
imagine, like, just everything that you've just explained. I'm just looking at what else is on my list here. When I wrote that list out, I was like, oh my God, like,
It's all confusing, isn't it?
like, so many questions. So I'd imagine having someone guide you through that, why you can primarily focus on
The care. Absolutely.
finding the best facility, and then worry about the rest later.
And let me touch on something we touched on earlier, the confusion between independent living, aged care. There's so many different alternatives. And if you make a mistake and you go down the retirement, say your parents got Alzheimer's or on the verge or dementia, and you, unbeknown to you, put them into a facility that's independent living where they've got no care needs, after a few months they'll be asked to leave, and there's an enormous amount of money at stake that you mightn't necessarily get back in full.
Wow.
Because the aged care is governed by Commonwealth Australian legislation, and it's well supported and government guaranteed, your bonds. But the retirement world is governed by state-based legislation. It's a different act of parliament, state-based, totally different model completely. There's nothing similar between retirement living and aged care when it comes to the model. We say we can help people with aged care, but if people come to us sometimes and they're really looking and correctly looking for retirement or independent living, we suggest they see a lawyer who's an expert in the area.
Yep.
You need a lawyer to enter retirement living.
How sad is that?
Yeah, it is.
Seriously.
And so there's easy to be confused. And the trend is now, just near where your gym is, if you're driving down Kooyong Road, that you'll see looks like a mini Chadstone coming out near North Road. There's a brand new aged care or a new facility coming out, which is both retirement living and aged care. So you could go in as a couple into the retirement living,
and then
no
move.
two people deteriorate at the same rate.
No.
As one needs more care, he or she could go next door down the corridor to aged care.
That's clever.
And you're left in the retirement. But you have to be able to fund both. So we've recently had a client who sold a small flat at a value of about $600,000. It's going to cost about $800,000 to get into the retirement. And we modelled so they know in advance, I'm going to need another $800,000 into aged care. So they're swapping $500,000 or $600,000 and potentially needing 1.6, not too far away, because one partner is ageing quite badly, quite quickly. So you need to be well informed.
I was going to say, that was one of my questions.
Yeah.
When do you start planning?
Yeah.
Because I would imagine you get a lot of people coming because it's urgent
Yeah.
and it needs to happen.
The sooner the better, really, when you start to notice it. Look, there's certain key times. Christmas time, you can, if you haven't seen an elderly person from one year to the next, you can pick up some signs. But yes, a lot of elderly people are really one fall away from a crisis.
Yes. Yeah.
Now, if you're not at all turning your mind to that or getting some basic information, when that happens, you get no time to think clearly, and it's it's panic stations. So if you can at least be informed and aware of, you could even do the modelling well in advance and have some idea how it can be funded and where to go.
And is there a wait list on these facilities?
Good question. It's with aged care, there can't really be a wait list, because if you need to go into aged care, you can't wait. You need to go. There can be for retirement, but not for aged care. So, no, you'd want to know in advance if someone around you is starting to really show signs of decline. Where of one or two places have I narrowed it down that I'd like to have mum or dad placed, and how are we going to fund it? So, the further in advance you can get at least a semblance of an idea.
And then you can press play.
Then you can press play
when you need to.
And then so
when you're not stressed.
When you're not stressed, because it is unbelievably stressful. Never happens at the right time. And as I said, it happens in our generation when we're juggling so much. Children in their teens, business, living, all the rest of it, and elderly parents.
It's crazy.
A minefield.
Thank you so much. I thought I had one of the most satisfying jobs, but I think you've got one of those, the joy that you must get when they do get in, and you see the relief on people's faces must be a really nice thing. So thank you for sharing all of that. If people want to get in contact with you for your services, where do we direct them?
Thank you. Be delighted to speak to anyone, no obligation whatsoever. We trade under the name Joseph Palmer and Sons. We're at 330 Collins Street. You can contact myself on either 9601 6886 or my mobile 0408 347474, or you can listen to this podcast in the future.
Yeah, absolutely. We'll have you back on. There'll be lots of questions, I reckon. Thank you so much, Rodney.
Thank you.
Thank you for joining us on this episode of What Next? I'm Kirsty Robbie, and if this episode sparked any questions and you want to know more, please hit us up on our socials at whatnext_with KR, and have a great day.
You're listening to another Torched Original. Are you feeling stuck when it comes to creating content for you and your business? Would you like a podcast of your very own? Or maybe you'd like to stand out and reach new audiences? Head to gettorched.com. That's GETTORCHT.com today, and we look forward to helping you on your content creation journey.